defendants in the courtroom. Anything for the state before we send for jurors?
No.
And for the defense?
Not at this time, Judge.
That's all right for the jury, please. Swing chairs.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you bright and early. We are ready to resume the trial of the case. Call your next witness, please.
Brani. Brani. Brani.
Good. I'm sorry. I do.
Please be seated.
All right, once you're comfortable, if you will, state your first and last name, and let's spell that for our court reporter as well.
My name is David Michael Brani. The last name is B-R-A-N-I.
And where are you employed, sir?
I'm employed with Applied Technical Services in Marietta, Georgia.
And that's in Cobb County?
It is.
How long have you been employed with ATS, or Applied Technical Services?
Full-time since about 2004.
And why don't you explain what ATS is?
It's an independent test lab that has a variety of engineering services. One of them is non-destructive testing. I do a lot of work in the paper mills, chemical plants. Another wing of it is material analysis, which is a part of the group I'm in. We also have calibration of instruments, dimensional analysis, and some other engineering services.
Okay. Is one of the things that ATS is capable of doing is doing some thermal testing?
Certainly. We have technicians and engineers that do thermal testing, and then I myself do this type of testing in support of industry and also in support of litigation matters.
Why don't you explain to the jury what sort of qualifications you have that allows you to work with ATS and do thermal testing?
Part of my background, I've received a 4-year degree in engineering, mechanical engineering from the University of Florida. Later on, I attended Georgia Tech and received through a PhD. My emphasis in graduate programs was the thermal sciences, which is thermodynamics, heat transfer, and fluid mechanics. Many of the things that I've done in this work I'm presenting today is related to the world of heat transfer, essentially, somewhat also fluid mechanics. Other areas of background, I had taught for about 11 years at Southern Polytechnic State University in their Mechanical Engineering Technology Department, and many of the same principles of engineering that apply to this I've applied in the classroom. And then also my work at ATS, I've had numerous occasions to use the type of instrumentation I was using for the testing that day in support of other, again, legal and non-legal matters over the years.
And do you have a PhD as well?
Yes, I do, a PhD from Georgia Tech.
Can you explain what the PhD is in?
It's in mechanical engineering, and again, as I said before, it's when you're in a PhD program, you can pick special emphasis of courses to take, and the primary emphasis for myself was again, the thermal science, it's fluid mechanics, heat transfer, and thermodynamics.
In layperson's terms, can you explain a little bit about thermodynamics and what that means, what we're talking about?
It's always difficult for me. Thermodynamics, as far as the relation to this, it's a little less. I think the primary subject would be heat transfer. But thermodynamics in general has to do with the behavior of fluids and other things as far as energy. So think of your home air conditioning system. Thermodynamics relates to helping a design engineer design a system for heating and cooling, things like that.
And what about heat transfer? How does that compare?
Heat transfer is part of thermodynamics in the sense that if you have a air conditioning refrigeration system, at some point you're transferring heat from the refrigerant system, for instance, to the outdoors. That's that unit outside that when we hear it dies and the compressor breaks, we all have the bad moment. The heat transfer issue then is the fluid that holds the coolant, the refrigeration system is trying to give up heat to the outside, and that's a heat transfer problem. And that's where the nature of heat transfer, if you will, kind of morphs into the world of thermodynamics.
And are there ways within your field of expertise that you can measure both thermodynamics and heat transfer?
A better question may be there's ways of taking measurements in both fields, and in both fields there's overlap as to the type of measurements. For example, in the world of thermodynamics / heat transfer, one of the things you may want to know is the flow of your speed of the air in the ducting system in your home air conditioning system. So you could take measurements to record that flow rate. Obviously, another one is temperature. We may want to keep track of temperature within the duct system to see how well we're cooling the air. Another would be pressure, for example, within the system. But there's a variety of techniques that are common to both.
I want to focus on that middle one that you just talked about, temperature. Do you have devices at ATS that are capable of documenting temperature at various locations?
Yes, we do. A variety of instrumentation. In this particular matter, I chose to use thermocouples. In addition, I had a temperature humidifier recorder, which was a separate type of device for measuring outside temperature.
And have you testified as an expert before in thermal testing and in heat transfer science?
I have, essentially, yes.
At this time tendering Dr. Brani as an expert in thermal testing and heat transfer science.
Matt White here. Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Brani.
Good morning.
Is it Brani or Brani?
I always say it rhymes with Granny, so.
Okay, Brani. All right. You said your primary, or the primary field that would apply in this case is heat transfer. Is that correct?
I think that's fair to say, yes.
Okay. And in your role as an engineer, a mechanical engineer at ATS, have you ever studied temperature rises in vehicles?
Outside of this case, no. I did do some study in preparation for the testing I did for this case, but as far as temperature monitoring in a vehicle, no, I've not done that.
But you did do some studies in prepping for this case?
I would say in prepping for the testing I did on site. In other words, prior to going on site, I just reviewed some general literature out there as to what other folks had done as far as testing went and some of their results.
Okay. Prior to testing outside in this case?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. Is it fair to say that a lot of your role as far as an expert in a legal case has got to do with maybe safety compliance? Is that accurate?
No, I think
Okay.
with my background, there's a variety of things that I get involved in the legal community. Machine guard safety is one issue, and safety in general, but that's just a component of what I do.
Okay. Have you ever testified in a criminal case?
No, I have not.
Have you ever been tendered as an expert in a case where you're being asked to measure the temperature inside a vehicle?
Well, again, specific to vehicles, no. In general, with respect to recording things like temperature and other items, yes, I have in the past. And in particular, from my world, from heat transfer and my background, it's not so much whether it's a vehicle or not. My main concern is the type of medium I'm measuring in this case it's air, in the range of temperature I'm in. For example, it's air in the order of 100 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to maybe in a furnace. I've done work in both, but the key component for me in this case is I'm measuring temperature and air and the relative values I'm at, and I routinely do that in the past.
Okay. So your expertise isn't limited to heat transfer of objects, like for example, heat and how it heats up a piece of metal on a machine?
No, it's not limited to that.
Okay. You've got plenty of experience in testing air for the temperature in the air?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have any objections.
You may so testify.
All right. You were called upon in this case by Cobb Police and the District Attorney's Office to perform a heat study at a specific location, that being the Home Depot treehouse. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And before we get to that, I want to tender States 386 for the record. This is a certified copy, self-authenticating with a business record certification from Dobbins Air Force Base regarding the specific temperatures from June the 18th of 2014. So I tender States 386.
Can we give that back to you?
You did.
Okay, no objection.
Admitted.
All right. When is it that you specifically went to the Home Depot treehouse location to do testing?
It would be July 18th, 2014.
If this offense occurred...
Excuse me, Counsel. July 8th, 2014.
Right, July 8th. If this offense occurred on or about June the 18th of 2014, how much time would have elapsed? Are we less than 3 weeks away?
I believe it's right at 3 weeks, plus or minus a day.
Okay. And in fact, we looked at a calendar online just to confirm that it was essentially, if the 18th was on a Wednesday, 2 weeks elapsed, and then on the Tuesday before, it would have been a full 3 weeks is when you went out to do the testing.
Right, that's correct.
Okay. And I want to talk about the temperature on July the 8th of 2014 as compared to the temperature that's documented from Dobbins Air Force Base in States Exhibit 386. First of all, describe for the jury what it is that you planned on doing going into the heat testing from July the 8th of 2014. What equipment were you planning on using and what was the purpose?
The primary purpose was to determine the temperature inside the vehicle throughout the day, for the day of testing that I did. I did secondary measurements, just depending on whether I would make use of them at a later time. So for example, as far as temperature goes, we ended up using about 12 different thermocouples. I had them placed around the vehicle at various locations. Some were at floorboards, some were at the ceiling, somewhere near the vicinity of the child's care seat. And in addition to that, then, I had recorded secondary data. Some of that data included continuous monitoring of the humidity and temperature in the vicinity in a shaded area, essentially getting the ambient or the outdoor temperature. In addition, I took measurements regarding wind speed. I had what's called a vane anemometer. It's a tool to attempt to measure wind speed, and I would record that every hour. Another measurement I was taking out there, I was using what's called a light meter. And a light meter just gives you an idea of the intensity of the sun and kind of the visible portion of light, how bright the sun is essentially. And I was taking those readings every hour during the day. Let's see, another reading I took was not so much measurement, but I had a constant video recording showing the vehicle throughout the day. Part of the issue for temperatures in the vehicle, of course, is going to be how much sunshine is falling on the car or partial shade, if you will. So I used a video recording throughout the day to watch the car so that if someone was interested, in my case and myself as well later, to go back and get a time lapse of how the sun was shining that day. That video was used for that purpose. Those were the primary things I was reporting on.
And you just mentioned something that I want to touch on. This entire process throughout the day was captured and recorded both using a video recorder, but you also took some photographs as well, correct?
Yes, and in fact, video I was using to capture the sunlight. I did take photographs in the sense that upon the hour, I would literally just look up and
Bless you.
write down what I thought the sky condition was at that instance. During the day, especially in the earlier portion, the sky condition was changing quite a bit, kind of in and out of sun, etc. So one of the things I would do at those time frames is I would aim my camera to the sky and take photographs to capture qualitatively what the sky was doing.
Now, during this process, were there investigators with the Cobb County District Attorney's Office and Cobb County Police present to monitor what was going on?
Yes, there were individuals from Cobb County out there with us that day.
And were you allowed access specifically to a Hyundai Tucson with a car seat in it so that you could put the thermocouples inside and measure the heat rise inside of that vehicle?
Yes, on a previous date, I went to the Cobb County facility where I had access to the vehicle, and at that point we set up our various thermocouples within the vehicle. This is a few days prior to the testing itself.
I'm going to show you a series of photographs, 381, 382, 383, 384. Are those fair and accurate depictions of the Tucson that you tested at the Home Depot Treehouse location from July the 8th of 2014?
Yes, they are.
You had a chance yesterday to look at State's Exhibit 379.
Yes.
And looking at 379, which for the record is a thumb drive, does it have the digital photographs of what we just referred to as 381 through 383 contained thereon?
That's my recollection, yes.
Okay. And in addition to that, after completing your testing, did you prepare a graph that showed the heat, the temperatures from the monitors, the sensors on the car seat, and would it be helpful if that was displayed to the jury so that you could describe what your findings were?
Yes, I did prepare the graph, and I think it is a good illustration to discuss the temperatures.
Looking at States 385, is that graph that shows the three temperature gauges that were placed on the car seat that monitored the temperature throughout the day on July the 8th of 2014?
Yes, it is.
And then going back to 379, there's a digital version of this graph as well. I think it's PDF form, is that correct?
The one I looked at on the thumb drive matches what I'm seeing in the paper.
This time, Judge, I would tender 381, 382, 383, 384, 385, and then 379.
Admitted.
Start by looking at some of the photographs on 379. Can y'all see that or no? Can you move closer? You're good? Okay. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Starting with State's Exhibit 379, and this would correspond to Exhibit 381 that the jury will have back in the jury room. Can you describe what's depicted here in 381?
This is the vehicle that was being tested that day, and it's parked in the Home Depot parking lot.
I'm going to talk about where specifically it's parked in just a moment. I want to ask you some questions first about some of the things that are visible around this vehicle. First of all, this pop-up canopy tent, can you explain what that is?
We just put a canopy tent in the background, that we have our data recorder underneath that tent on a rolling cart, and then we had some other various items that we had just stored underneath there during the day.
Inside this vehicle, is there a car seat that's placed in the center of the back bench?
Yes.
And did you put 3 heat sensors on that car seat so that you could monitor the temperature throughout the day?
Yes, and I would say instead of the use of the word heat sensors, I would just say temperature recording devices. But yes, there was 3 in the car seat.
Fair enough. Looking at State's Exhibit 382, we'll go to the version on 379. This is that vehicle from a different angle, is that correct?
That's correct. And this series of photographs, from my recollection, is, again, periodically I would walk around the vehicle and take photos. I had video running, but also just on occasion would walk around the vehicle and take snapshots around it.
This jury yesterday saw this vehicle parked in the same spot in the Home Depot parking lot. So I want to ask you about that because we need to make a record as well. Are there two, I don't know what you call them, two little islands that have trees that it's parked in between?
Yes, some pine straw islands nearby.
And so that we can get our bearings in the background of this particular exhibit, which is 382. Can you see a little shed that might give us some guidance when we look at these aerials just to compare?
Yes, at the top of the vehicle in the left corner, right behind that is a shed.
And then we'll just scroll through these real quick. State's Exhibit 383. That's the vehicle from the front, correct? Just to confirm the location of where it was placed, correct?
Yes, this would be more of a view looking from the Home Depot building that was in the parking lot back towards the vehicle.
And of course, these observers here, one of these observers here in the courtroom, one of our investigators of the Cobb DA's office. Do you recognize these? And is this one of your employees or assistants?
That may be from this distance, I believe that's Eric Monroe. That's an engineer that was out there assisting me.
We're now on State's Exhibits 384, just from a different vantage point, is that correct?
Yes.
And then 3. This is on 279, the last photograph. I'm not sure where I put that, but that's the same vehicle from the driver's side perspective, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, looking at this vehicle, were you able to gather evidence and document the temperature both inside the vehicle and outside the vehicle throughout the day?
Yes.
I want to talk about the parking spot that was used here. We marked this on both the state's and defense's exhibits, just to be fair to both sides. So I'm going to show you what's been previously marked, identified, and admitted as State's Exhibit 231. You've seen this exhibit before. We looked at it both yesterday and today, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I asked you to assist me in placing a red tab on the specific spot that's in this parking lot so that we could confirm it's in the exact spot that we saw in the Home Depot video. Does that accurately mark the spot where the vehicle was placed in between those two islands with the trees?
It does.
And then similarly, again, to be fair to both sides, this is defense exhibit. I can't make that out. I don't know what exhibit number that is.
I'm not sure.
Somebody tell me what exhibit number that is. It probably is. You want to confirm?
Yeah, let me check.
35? Did you want to maybe fix that? That's a lot better. Looking at defendant's exhibit 35, the aerial that was produced by the defense, this is the same parking lot, correct?
Yes.
All right, and having looked at both of these exhibits, is that the same spot that's depicted here on the photographs that were shown to the jury, as documented in the Home Depot video that was seen yesterday?
It is.
Okay. Now, having placed this vehicle in that spot, you were able to gauge the temperatures outside and inside the vehicle, correct?
Yes.
All right, I want to go to the I want to go to the Dobbins records. Third page back. The highest temperature listed on the Dobbins records for June the 18th of 2014, it's about 92 degrees. The average here in the last column converted temperature is 91 degrees. And it's got a time as well, local time, which would be about 1558. What's the hottest it got on July the 8th, 2014, less than 3 weeks after this date, to have a comparison?
Based on my data, it was 91 degrees Fahrenheit was the maximum outdoor air temperature.
Okay, so 92 on June the 18th per the Dobbins records, which would be State's Exhibit 386, about a degree off in terms of the temperature just 3 weeks later, correct?
On the maximum, yes.
And did you document the temperature throughout the day on the exterior of the vehicle so we can have a comparison to what the actual temperature was from June the 18th of 2014?
I did. We were using a thermocouple system for the interior temperatures. I was using a separate device for the exterior humidity and temperature. And that recording system makes a paper chart essentially. So I have a paper chart showing the variation in outdoor temperature throughout that day.
All right. Let's go through some of these times just so we can have a comparison. Do you have those notated in front of you? And I want to start with the morning temperature. So if the Dobbins records show local time around 9 o'clock, 78 degrees, give or take. What was the temperature that you had? 78.8 is what the Dobbins records show from July the 8th, or June the 18th.
Yeah, so at 9 a.m. on the day of my testing, the outdoor temperature was 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, so within a degree or so, but 78.8 from the Dobbins records, correct?
Speaks for itself, but yes.
Okay, let's go to noontime at 11:58 per the local records, 386 from Dobbins. Temperature here is 86.0. What's the temperature that you documented less than 3 weeks later?
We were at 88 degrees Fahrenheit at that time.
Okay, so a couple of degrees different. Let's look at 1 o'clock. I've got 12:58 local time here. What temperature did you show? The Dobbins records show 87.8.
We were at 88 at that point, and at about that time, the recorder itself, the temperature shortly after 1 o'clock jumped from 88 to 91 within about a 15-minute period, 20.
Okay, so let's look at that 91. That's the peak time for the day that you did your testing, correct?
That's correct.
All right, so at 15:58, which would be almost 4 o'clock, 3:58 in the afternoon, Dobbins records show for June the 18th of 2014, could be as high as 92, but the average in the last column was 91.4. What's the temperature you gauge on your testing from July the 8th?
It was 91.
Roughly the same testing temperature then?
Well, again, it's from a heat transfer standpoint for this issue, essentially the same, but again, a degree or two off, depending on the...
And then I want to talk about 4 o'clock, closest temperature we have to 4 o'clock on June the 18th of 2014, per the Dobbins Air Force Base records, would be 15:58 hours, which is 3:58 in the afternoon. What was the temperature you gauged there?
91 still.
Okay, and this was 91.4 here in the last column, correct?
That's what that sheet's showing.
All right. So now having established that it's essentially the same temperature outside July the 8th of 2014 as it was on June the 18th of 2014, I want to ask you about the temperature readings inside the vehicle. How did you gather the temperature readings from the car seat inside the vehicle?
Well, again, we use thermocouples, and essentially a thermocouple, there's various styles, but it's two wires. In our case, they're twisted together, and what happens is the electrical resistance of the wire changes with temperature. So there's a low current going through the wire. The data recording system is tracking any essentially resistance or voltage change, and it converts that to a temperature. So these individual twisted wires then I placed at various locations, in particular for the car seat at 3 different locations.
I want to take a look at what's now still displayed for the jury of States Exhibit 381 from thumb drive 379. For most of the day that you were there documenting the measurements of the temperature inside and outside of the vehicle, was the vehicle in direct sunlight?
It just depends. It was not in any sunlight until about 10 o'clock in the morning. Up until that point, the neighboring trees were shading the vehicle from sunlight. Starting at 10 a.m., sun started to reach the front of the car. And then, as far as the sun itself went, the sun was shining on the parking lot up until about 11:30 in the morning. And again, this is illustrated through the video I was recording. From 11:30 till almost 1 o'clock, it was in and out of sun. But then we had a period of time from about 1 o'clock until 2:30 where it was pretty much direct sunshine.
As is depicted on the photograph in front of the jury?
Yes, that would be representative of direct sunshine, if you will.
All right, and when did you begin the actual testing or the actual recording of the temperature inside the vehicle from the car seat?
We began our recording at about 9 a.m., or yes, 9 a.m.
Prior to that, was the vehicle, did you run the vehicle and turn on the air conditioning so that you could create a circumstance as if the vehicle had just been parked there?
I had operated the vehicle for about 30 minutes, and then, although we started recording temperatures inside at 9, we actually physically parked the vehicle at 8:22 a.m. So a little before 8 o'clock, I'd have to look at a video again. I was driving the vehicle, partly to let the engine reach full operating temperature. Also, as far as the air conditioning settings, what was as found in the vehicle is where the setting was. So I didn't alter the setting. They were set for the AC to be on. So I drove the vehicle for about 20 minutes or so, or 30, with the air conditioning on, and then at 8:22 a.m. parked it in the spot depicted in that photograph.
Okay. And then in the 9 o'clock hour, did you begin recording temperatures at any point?
Yes, right about 9 a.m. is when we began our thermobaric recordings.
And why don't you describe to the jury what was the internal temperature near the car seat location around 9 o'clock in the morning?
Because of the AC running, it was on the order of about 65 degrees Fahrenheit.
And what was the outside temperature compared to the inside at that point in the morning?
Again, right around 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
So it's cooler inside the vehicle because of the air conditioning when you initially parked it and started the testing?
That's correct.
All right. And now I want to ask you, did you see a progression throughout the day of the temperature inside the vehicle rising until the point that you ended your testing?
Yes, and essentially two different progressions. Initially, there was a certain slope to it, and then later in the day, as I said before, after about 1 o'clock, the sun was bearing down pretty much direct full time, and temperatures continued to rise, but at a faster pace at that point.
Having established that initially the car was cooler on the interior than the exterior temperature, can you please articulate to the jury when it is that those temperatures matched up with each other in the day? In other words, when did the temperature inside the vehicle match the external temperature of the day?
Right at about 11:35 in the morning.
11:35. And what temperature did you have at 11:35 in the morning?
Both at the car seat and the exterior was at 88 degrees Fahrenheit.
I want to ask you about a particular point in time, around 12:30, 12:45. Were you able to gauge the temperature inside and outside of that vehicle at that time?
Yes.
What was the external temperature at around 12:45 on the day of your testing?
About 98 degrees Fahrenheit at the car. I'm sorry, at the car seat it was 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the exterior it was 88.
98 degrees
At
at
the car seat.
12:45.
Yes.
And then I want to ask you, doctor, when is the first time that the interior of that vehicle rose to a level above 100 degrees?
Would have been shortly before 1 p.m.
Do y'all see this? All right. Doctor, I'm going to have you step down for a second. I'm going to get you to walk over with me to the graph. Have the digital version displayed. This would be States 385. Looking at States 385, we need to make a description for the record and for the jury. of what can be seen here. What's the left-hand column that the jury is looking at here? What does that depict?
That's going to be the air temperature corresponding to each of the graphs.
Okay, so we start at air temperature 55, and the highest that would be on here is 145, is that correct?
Yes.
And then the bottom part of this graph, describe what this shows for our jury, please.
This is just a timeline, so each marking is denoting. So if I want to know a certain time, say 10:13, I'd come up, hit the graph, come over and read the temperature.
You have a key in the upper left-hand corner of this chart. Describe what that key depicts.
It's just verbiage to remind myself of where the thermocouples were. So in the order of the key is in the order of the graph. So the top red line, this would be a thermocouple placed above the child seat at forward end of the child seat.
How about the light blue line?
The light blue would be also above the car seat at the foot end of the car seat.
And then this last line, I'm going to call it, what, purple?
Sure. So the bottom line, I took one of the thermocouples and twisted it in the fabric of the car seat.
And notably, your results showed that the temperature basically tracked each other at the different points of the car seat. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and the other thing too, as I mentioned before, I had a variety of thermocouples in there, so I also had thermocouples near the ceiling of the car and the floorboard. And that data I also looked at one point just to get an idea of how the data was tracking. Because these three are about the same height in this car, they track together. If you looked at a similar series of graphs at the top of the car, they also track together at a higher temperature, and then of course the floorboard at a lower temperature.
And you say, of course, the floorboard, because it's lower and heat rises, would you expect that it might be a lower temperature of the floorboard versus a higher point, such as the car seat or maybe even a visor?
So that's the heat transfer principle.
Okay. So these three are actually focused on the car seat itself, since that's the subject matter of this particular case, correct?
That's what's displayed here, yes.
And here at 926, what can be displayed here? What does this graph indicate to you in terms of what's happening with the temperature inside that vehicle near the car seat?
Simply again, that because of the AC setting, the car seat area is on the order of 65 Fahrenheit, maybe a little less. And what it's showing is once we park the vehicle, and again, the AC has been off now, that now the outdoor air being warmer than the inside, the car seat area is beginning to warm up now.
And then I want to look at some various times here. I'd asked you specifically about 12:45. That would fall in between two times that are basically dead center on your graph. Is that correct?
Yes, that's fair to say.
So let's take the low and the high. At 12:34 p.m. using your graph, you can move up here and let's see, is that about accurate? You know, it's touch screen. You can touch basically where it is.
Right.
And what was the temperature that you documented around that time?
Well, again, as you can see around that time at 12:34, at least above the car seat area, it's at 95 degrees Fahrenheit.
And then, because I want to focus on that period of time, around 12:50, if I'm getting that up right.
12:50, we've risen about 3 degrees to 98.
And then I want to talk to you about reaching the temperature in excess of 100 degrees. About what time did you find that in your documentation as you were recording the temperatures inside the vehicle?
Well, 100 degrees would be midpoint between our two black lines. So if I come down, again, just roughly about 1 o'clock in the afternoon is where the 100, excuse me, make sure, where the 100 degree reading would be.
Okay. Right in there is 105, so somewhere lower than that.
Yes.
And then the peak period of time in terms of your sensors recording activity, at the peak, what temperature did you gauge at that car seat?
Again, based on the graph, if you go back to the black line, right at about 125 degrees Fahrenheit.
And what time of day was that when it reached 125 degrees?
This would have been, again, going down approximately 3:30.
And then finally on your graph, the last time that you have depicted here is about 4:14 in the afternoon, 4:15, is that correct?
Yes.
And what was the temperature then when the vehicle was accessed? is a good point. Some of our jurors may not be familiar with Cobb County. I sometimes forget that we're not home in Cobb where people may know what different things are. Do you know what Dobbins Air Force Base is?
I do.
Okay, and just explain where is that in terms of Cobb County?
Dobbins Air Force Base is just a little south of Marietta City proper. With relation to the Home Depot property, it would be north of this site, and I believe a little bit to the east.
Okay, so it's very close, certainly within the county where the Home Depot treehouse is located. Is that correct?
Both are within the same county, and relatively speaking, it's a close data recording station.
A pretty easy drive to each other, correct?
Yes,
All right.
except for Atlanta traffic.
Yes, sir. I think that's all I have at this time.
Cross-examine oath.
Thank you. I just have another,
No.
get on my house in order.
What do you plan on doing today?
Dr. Brani, I'm showing you what's been previously marked as Defendant's Exhibit 46. You recognize that as the sheet or the page on your Excel spreadsheet that you created of the external data. That's the measurements of outside the vehicle on July the 8th, correct?
Not quite. It's there's two things going on. This sheet is from my spreadsheet. The primary it's showing here is the individual data points I recorded approximately every 15 minutes. I think I said before every hour. This would be wind speed, our light meter readings, sky condition. Also included on that is a snapshot of the temperature values that I read off of our data recorder. But the actual data recording temperatures were in the chart portion of the recorder. So this data is data I took, and this is from my spreadsheet, though, yes.
I will move D46 in evidence.
I don't have any objection. That's your work product, is that correct?
It's part of my file.
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't have any objection to that.
Submit.
And I'm showing you what's also been previously marked as Defendant's Exhibit 47. I'm showing you a one-page supplemental police report from Cobb County Police Department. And Judge, I've shown this to opposing counsel. I'm going to move Defendant's 47 in.
Well, that would be hearsay. It's a one-page police report prepared by Officer Adam Check, apparently, about what some other person said to him.
Your Honor, we've previously had this issue come up. This is an exception to hearsay. This is a public record. Pursuant to the Georgia rules, this would be admissible. And for the truth of the matter and for the record, it is a list of temperatures received from Dobbins Air Force Base.
Object to him going into substance of it. It's not been admitted, and renew my objection.
You said. I sustain the objection.
Your Honor, may I make a proffer?
Absolutely.
showing you what's been denoted as D46. You talked about how it doesn't simply have the data points for temperature outside, but it also includes measurements for wind, correct?
Yes,
Humidity?
yes.
And on the subject of humidity, perhaps we all know from our common experience, but just from a scientific standpoint, can you explain how humidity affects temperature?
In general, humidity, if it was relatively on the high end or it was a very moist environment, it may affect heat transfer in the sense that you get condensation like you would on your car this morning, and that would affect heat transfer. For the range of humidities for the testing that day, as far as I sit here, I don't believe that has any real bearing on the actual heat transfer mechanisms.
Okay. Well, just to be clear, was there not a heat index on July the 8th?
Well, again, my understanding of a heat index is more for how an individual body would feel in a situation like that. It doesn't apply to objects that are metals, fabric, whatever. There's no wind chill associated with the vehicle.
So the measurements that you conducted doesn't necessarily equate or detect how temperature feels to a human, right?
Oh, no, certainly not. All these temperatures are relating is what the air temperature was in the near vicinity of those individual thermocouples.
And you used a thermocouple outside to detect external temperature?
No, what I was relying on for outside temperature was a temperature humidity recording device, which is a separate system or separate unit.
Okay. Did you have a similar unit that detected humidity inside the vehicle?
No, I was not recording humidity within the vehicle.
You would agree that a vehicle isn't like 100% sealed off from the outside. I mean, if the air vents are on, air can enter inside the vehicle through the lower compartment of the vehicle, through the engine, okay, and come inside of these air vents, right?
For this particular vehicle, I can't speak with direct knowledge. All I can say in general is I certainly wouldn't expect the vehicle to be airtight, if you will.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it. It's not airtight.
Correct.
So certainly, air from the outside is able to come inside of a vehicle.
In theory, it's able to. Again, one of the issues that this testing helps me with, though, there's a variety of factors that can affect the internal temperature of the vehicle, but because we are taking direct readings, we know what the air temperature was. There's certainly factors that can alter it, some more than others, but regardless of the factors, we just physically just went directly and measured temperatures.
What about breathing? Would heavy breathing affect the inside temperature of a vehicle?
Well, again, the data I took was testing a vehicle where there was no occupants in it, and all I can speak for is the temperature for a vehicle tested in that scenario. These were the air temperatures, the internal temperatures I was getting for that day. As far as whether or not, the question you've asked, I don't have any idea either way. That wasn't part of the testing I was doing.
Okay. Now, in preparation for setting up the testing in this case, you testified that you tried to read up on some literature. Did you look at any other experiments that measured humidity inside of the vehicle?
No, the only ones I recall looking at were dealing with reporting on temperatures.
Do you know if those temperatures accounted for humidity or heat index?
Again, all I can recall is the recording of temperature. But no, with regard to humidity, I'm not aware either way.
As far as preparing your protocol for conducting this test, you met with the district attorney's office, correct?
Yes, in particular, Bob Tressel was my first point of contact.
You emailed with Bob Tressel, correct?
Yes.
If the trial team had questions about your data, you would communicate through Mr. Bob Tressel.
That's correct.
You met with members of the Cobb County Police Department.
Just in that I think that I'd gone out to the Cobb County facility where the vehicle was stored, and I believe in addition to Bob Tressel, there may have been one other person associated with Cobb County there. And then again, on the day of testing, we had, I believe, at least 2 different people from Cobb County that were out there at some point during the day.
You remember this gentleman sitting here on the front row, Detective Phil Stoddard. Do you remember him on scene on July the 8th, 2014?
I do.
And anyone else that's sitting behind the state that you recognize from being on scene?
Not immediately, but in one of the photos we showed earlier, there was a female, and she was, my understanding is she was with Cobb County.
And Dr. Brani, about how much time did you put into your work in this case, total?
I don't have that before me right now. In terms of monetary, it was probably on the order of about $24,000 of work billed through ATS for my time and other support.
Is that an hourly rate?
It would depend on the individual that's working. Some employees involved in the project were a lower hourly rate. My involvement, I spent, again off the top of my head, probably a full day between communications and getting out to the site and looking at the vehicle initially, another afternoon in instrumenting the vehicle. Of course, a full day of testing at the site. There was also follow-up hours to take care of the data management, and then we also did pre-calibration of equipment, et cetera. There was other time spent.
What is your hourly rate?
I believe my hourly rate for this activity was $295 an hour.
Can you ballpark how many hours you put in to research and prepping for the testing?
No, I think without looking at other documents, but again, roughly research, I probably spent a couple hours just seeing other studies that were out there. As far as pre-test prepping, again, it may be on the order of 12 hours.
And how'd you go about researching the other experiments and other studies, other literature that was out there?
Well, about like everybody else does. I get on Google and start typing, and then just looking for other folks that may have done this type of testing before. Again, just trying to do a little bit of homework. I had a game plan in mind, but I just wanted to reach out to the community and through that type of research just to see what others had done.
After Googling, who did you reach out to?
I probably have it listed in my file folder. I have a sheet of paper where I had made a synopsis of some of that research. One of the things I gleaned from it was that there's talk in other papers where the typical change in temperature, in other words, the max temperature within the vehicle versus outside, past studies typically report on the order of 40 degrees Fahrenheit change. So if you have a vehicle parked in the sun, past studies have shown that the maximum temperature of the vehicle tends to be no greater than about 40 degrees at the outside. And in our data up there, for example, our maximum temperature of 125 is about 35 degrees higher than the 90 degrees outside temperature. So I was just looking at studies like that, one, to see if there's anything I needed to be aware of in my testing, and two, to look at the post-test data to feel comfortable with what we had. So that's some of the usage of that search, though.
Okay. So do I understand your testimony to be that at the conclusion of your testing and you got your results, you compared it to what the other literature and other research out there was?
At one point I did. And really just one particular study with the delta T. There was a study, I believe it was done in Australia,
Okay.
and my recollection is that our temperature tracking was consistent with their findings.
Do you recall the name of that Australian study?
Not off the top of my head, but again, I'm not relying on that study for the opinions I have here today.
Sure. But having been tendered as an expert and having testified that you researched the work of others in this field, you specifically recall this experiment, this study, the Australian one, to compare your work at the end of your testing.
Well, again, compare in the sense of it was another study done. Of course, it's not going to be the same vehicle. I don't recall exactly where their thermocouples were placed in relation. Again, it's just a back of the envelope check to see how our data look compared to other folks.
Did the Australian study use thermocouples?
My recollection is they did, yes.
You remember what year?
No, I don't.
Let me move on to the condition of the vehicle. You testified that you went out to the Cobb County Police Department and inspected the vehicle at their evidence shed?
That's correct.
Okay. And were there contents inside the vehicle at that point?
Yes.
Okay. There was a car seat?
Yes.
Okay. There was musical equipment?
Yes, my recollection in the back storage area, there was some musical equipment there.
Okay. Some big amps?
That's my recollection, yes.
Okay. Some guitar pedals? Did you see that?
I didn't recall specifics, but I did take photographs at the time, so photographs in my file would give an indication of what was in the vehicle at the time of my initial visit to the Cobb County facility.
And in the process of setting up your thermocouple wiring, in order to keep the wires fixed in the spots that you wanted, you had to wrap them around things, right? Fixed objects within the vehicle,
Yes,
like the rear view mirror, correct?
certainly.
In fact, the rear view mirror was one of the data points that you had selected.
That's correct.
There's a thermocouple that's wrapped around the visor, right?
Yeah, my recollection is that, again, one of the things I did is when we placed the thermocouples, I took photographs of each thermocouple as to how they were placed on the vehicle. So that type of information I recorded, so if someone wanted to know that answer. As far as specifics, memory, I can't recall each specific instance as to how we wrapped or tied or whatever, but the photographs would show that.
Did you review the photographs that you took prior to your testimony today?
I have not.
Just the 3 or 4 that the state admitted into evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
You set up thermocouples on top of the car seat, correct?
Yes, in fact, it's a report that I provided to Cobb County, and my understanding was provided to defense. There's a photograph depicting the 3 thermocouples near the car seat as far as how they were arranged and secured.
You testified that one of them is actually twisted and inserted inside the cloth of the car seat, correct?
That's correct.
There are 2 that are kind of floating above the car seat, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the ends, the probes of those thermocouples, they're not touching anything, right?
That's my recollection.
They're not touching an object, so the temperature that it's detecting is in the air, correct?
Yes, in fact, that's true of all the thermocouples in the vehicle,
Well, the thermocouple that is
with the exception of the cloth. I'm sorry.
embedded in the cloth, it's touching the cloth, right?
That's correct.
And so when heat is absorbed in the car seat, in the cloth, that thermocouple is going to detect the heat being stored inside the cloth, correct?
It's going to get an idea of the cloth's temperature near its upper layer. The general premise of this car is it's complicated in the sense that you have a variety of materials, and each material by their bulk can retain a certain amount of energy. So for example, as the sun is shining on the vehicle, the reception of that heat from the sun depends in part on the material itself. Certain painted colors absorb heat differently than the sun from others. Likewise, those objects in the vehicles, whether it's a car seat or a seat in the vehicle, as they're receiving heat from the sun, they can also store. They have a capacity to store heat. So you have all these objects within the vehicle that are reacting differently from the sun. In turn, those objects, as they're being heated, they're interacting with the air in the vehicle. So you have all of this heat transfer between things. And at the end of the day, the data we were after is just simply what was the air temperature in the near vicinity, for example, of the car seat and these other areas I just instrumented up. As far as being embedded in the cloth seat, because it's not truly just out in the air, you're going to have a difference because of the solid cloth seat, etc. So yeah, an object is going to behave differently if you were looking at the temperature. If you're looking at the temperature below the car seat a little bit, it would be a little different than the air.
And because you were measuring a vehicle with an empty car seat that didn't account for humidity inside that vehicle, you'd agree that your experiment, your testing, wouldn't account for the heat that comes off and emanates from a human being and is stored inside that car seat and is circulating within the compartment of that vehicle.
I think from my aspect of it, that particular issue, obviously we didn't have someone in the vehicle. From a just general heat transfer characteristics, if the item in the vehicle is a warmer temperature than the surrounding air in the vehicle, then that's acting as a heat source to the vehicle. So in our testing, our primary heat source as the day progressed was the sun. Early in the morning, if you have a body in there, they're going to be adding heat to the vehicle. So that's one factor.
Now, is that based on your experience and your training, or is that just kind of a common sense understanding of greenhouse effect and the way that our bodies work?
Based on experience in the sense of, I'm not talking so much of a person now, but just of an object at a temperature. So if I were to take an object and place it in the vehicle, let's suppose that object was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, in the morning, the vehicle temperature started out in the 60s because of the air conditioning. So if a body is in the car and it's at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, just to pick a value, it would be adding heat that would not have been captured during my testing. So in theory, the temperature may be a little warmer where that body was. Just an aspect like that.
Okay. And what about like a big amplifier box that had been sitting in the car for who knows how long? I mean, that item would also, depending on how hot it got, it would generate as a secondary heat source inside the vehicle.
No, because the object itself is not actually generating any heat. The object is just responding to heat transfer to it and from it and a temperature. A human body is actually generating heat. If you can think of if I had a bucket of water and the water was being heated, that bucket of water is serving as a heat generation. But if I had that same bucket of water and I wasn't heating or cooling, now it's just an object that's either responding to absorbing heat or letting go of heat. But it in of itself is not generating heat.
Okay. So, I mean, in this case, y'all took steps to make sure that the objects that were inside the vehicle when it was found on June the 18th, 2014, remained in the vehicle for purposes of your testing. But the items that were there, that they wouldn't contribute to the temperature inside the vehicle?
They contribute in the sense, again, as you have the heat from the sun coming in, depending on where that object is, if it's seeing sunlight and its properties of that object, it's going to respond by absorbing heat from the sun a certain way. In turn, it's going to be losing heat or affecting the heat of the air in the vehicle. But I wouldn't expect, whether it's an amplifier or something else, it would have no greater or less influence than any other parts of the interior of the car. And at the end of the day, the nuances I would expect would be very minimal. In other words, if we ran this test without the amps, for example, I don't think you'd see any real temperature change.
May I ask why you made sure that they were still in the vehicle then?
I didn't personally make sure. That was how the vehicle was presented to me from Cobb County when we instrued it up. My understanding was that the items in the vehicle were the same at the time the vehicle was, I guess, impounded, short of the car seat itself was an exemplar car seat. From my standpoint, as you'd mentioned before, cars can leak air, et cetera. Of course, different cars can leak different amounts. So trying to do a test that's apples to apples as best as possible, obviously using the same vehicle, parking in the same spot, things like that. As far as individual components in the vehicle, my recollection is that it's the same with the data loss, but again, I don't think it's a big influence either way on the outcome.
Did I hear you correctly that you used an exemplar car seat?
I didn't personally use it. An exemplar car seat was in the vehicle.
In other words, that wasn't the original car seat?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And who told you that?
It would have been either Bob Tressel or one of the others at Cobb County.
When was it taken out?
That I don't know.
When was the second car seat put in?
Again, all I know is when I saw the vehicle for the first time, my understanding was that it was a different car seat. Same make and model is my understanding, but not the car seat.
In preparing your report, is it, and having reviewed it, is it accurate that you operated the vehicle, Mr. Harris's SUV, for approximately 30 minutes and then parked the vehicle at 8:22 in the morning?
Yes.
Okay. Whose decision was it to drive the vehicle for 30 minutes?
That was my decision.
So there wasn't anything about the drive time and your decision to drive for 30 minutes that was done to replicate anything on June the 18th?
Only in the sense that my understanding was the vehicle had, of course, been driven for some period of time before it being parked. So what I did is pick a time where I felt that the engine had fully come up to temperature and the AC had a chance to fully air condition the cabin.
Were you made aware that on the morning of June the 18th, Mr. Harris drove from his home to Chick-fil-A, parked, went inside and had breakfast with his son for 15, 20 minutes, got back in the car, and then drove to the Treehouse parking lot?
I had an understanding that at some point they had gone to the Chick-fil-A as far as exact timelines and what actually was done or whatever. I don't have any knowledge on that at all. I just knew in general the vehicle had been operated before it was parked there. But I wasn't taking into account that exact timeline of the decisions I was making for my testing.
Okay. I mean, you really have no way of knowing then if the starting temperature for your testing was similar to the starting temperature on June the 18th at the Home Depot parking lot.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. On June the 18th, when Mr. Harris shuts the door and goes into work at 9:25 in the morning, you don't know if the starting temperature at that point is similar to the starting temperature for your testing at 8:22 in the morning on July the 8th.
If there's that hour difference, I would not. On the other hand, essentially, from the testing that I did, at some point, the air in the car, the conditioned air, of course, it's being heated. At that time, the sun's not on the car yet. So at some point, the car is attempting to reach the same temperature as the outside. But I do want to point out, just to be careful with how this data is read, is whatever is really happening before 11:30, it's dictating what temperature the car would have been at that time, but it's not affecting what happens in the afternoon time. By the afternoon time, from a heat transfer standpoint, those initial factors of the car are no longer in play. So what we're talking about here is if the vehicle was parked an hour later than when I parked it, I would expect the vehicle at that time to be cooler than my values, because if the AC had been on, so I would expect the interior of the car to be less on the day of the incident than it was on the day of my testing, based on what you're telling me as far as when the car was parked.
I'm not sure I understand how we need to be careful about reading your data points in the morning and then not having an effect on the temperatures in the afternoon. So that the jury understands your evidence, why should they be careful about looking at your data?
Just be cautious about how to read it. In other words, if I've turned the vehicle AC on at 9 in the morning and had it running, and I shut the vehicle off then, when I get to 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the day of our testing, it's my experience in heat transfer and thermodynamics that that residual cooling has long been taken care of, essentially. So running the AC an additional hour, for example, and shutting down, it may make a difference in the vehicle temperature in the near frame of time that morning, but as time progresses, that gets washed out by the other heat transfer effects.
But and to be fair, you weren't made aware that Mr. Harris was running his AC for an hour before he parked his vehicle on June the 18th, 2014.
No, but on the flip side, I tried to run the AC for what I thought was a substantial amount of time so the cabin could have a chance to cool down. So I was running it in the settings as found. One of the temperature settings was 65 Fahrenheit on the dash. And I ran it for 30 minutes on a day that was essentially 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So the AC was activated for that full time. But as far as the length of time compared to what it was actually run, no, that wasn't the intent of that.
What's nice about Georgia is that the temperature can and the weather can change in an instant. We've experienced that. But there are times in the summer where the mornings are very, very comfortable, correct? And then there's a pretty extreme rise in temperature throughout the day, correct?
Well, again, in general for the weather, it's sure.
You had no idea Mr. Harris was actually running his air conditioning the morning of June the 18th, 2014, did you?
Well, again, all I can tell you is that was the settings as I found it on the vehicle when I did my testing.
And those were the settings as you found the vehicle after Mr. Harris got into his car after 4 o'clock on June the 18th when it was a very hot summer's day, correct?
That's my understanding, is the last setting would have been late in the afternoon.
And the Dobbins Air Force Base temperatures have been admitted in the evidence. It's a lot hotter at the end of the day than it is at the very beginning of the morning.
Well, again, though, for my testing, not knowing the AC settings and attempting to get the temperatures in the vehicle, I certainly didn't want to do testing that, I wanted to get a conservative value. So I knew that running the air conditioning, for example, would tend to drive down the temperatures in the early morning than, for example, if I just ran the heater. So my choice was just to run the air conditioning, knowing that that would be conservative as far as how the vehicle air temperature went in the morning time.
I'm gonna put the whole thing in that I gave you, but that's fine.
I'm gonna put this in. I'm showing what's been pre-marked for identification purposes as D48. That's a photograph that you took, right?
Yes.
And photograph you took in the testing of the air temperature, in this case, on July the 8th.
Yes.
I'm gonna read D48. No objection.
Admitted.
You'd agree that this photograph shows a time of 8:23, correct?
I'd have to see it again.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, 8:23. All right. And you notice that there's a reading for the outside temperature there,
Yes.
and that is 74 degrees.
Yes.
At 8:55, well, this is the internal temperature. Do you have your external temperature there?
I have 78 degrees Fahrenheit.
78 degrees. Do you know why there's a 4-degree discrepancy between the air temperature that you detected and the air temperature in the vehicle?
Well, again, I think that air temperature, it's recording of what it thinks the outside temperature is.
Correct.
No, I don't. I can tell you that based on my own vehicles, quite often when I look at its recording of the outside temperature, it seems to differ from what's being reported on the radio, for example. But as far as why there's a difference there, I don't know.
Okay. Depending on what you're using to detect temperature, you may not get the same result, right? The same reading.
Depending on where the monitoring's being done, yes.
And looking at your chart here, you agree that at between 9:11 and 9:26, the car seat has been cooled down to just above 60 degrees?
That would be the thermocouple that's above the air above the forward part of the car seat.
I mean, that's pretty cool. And typically in the summer when we're running our AC, we wouldn't lower our homes down to 62 degrees.
Well, again, all I can tell you is that I started with the AC setting that I had. I let it run for 30 minutes. I'm trying to recall how comfortable or not I was in the vehicle time. I recall it was cold. But as far as whether or not that's a low temperature cabin for someone driving at that time of day, I don't have a thought either way on that because that really doesn't affect the opinions I have. But it was certainly cool in the car when I exited that morning.
And you've been provided no information, no evidence that on June the 18th, 2014, that the car seat was cooled to just above 60 degrees.
Well, again, as far as evidence of what the temperatures were on the actual date of loss that were truly in the vehicle at the time, I do not. It's possible that if someone had not run the AC as its lowest setting, for instance, in the morning, then again, I think this is the more conservative, that the cooler temperatures I'd expect at the car seat would have been in the 60s as we're talking about. Certainly if someone's in the cabin adjusting for morning, it may be higher than that.
They may not even have the AC on at all.
Well, yeah, that's correct, yeah. In other words, if the AC is not on at all, you may have temperatures that are more akin to the outside temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But my point is with this subject is this: when you look at the graph on the far left, if we had started out at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, I would expect in the early hour, 2 hours, that would make somewhat of a difference in how the temperature data would track, of course. But as the course of the day would go on, I wouldn't expect it to have any difference. At best, our temperature curves may track a little higher in the morning hours, but in the afternoon hours, that residual start temperature wouldn't matter by then.
I believe you testified that this parking spot that Mr. Harris parked in was mostly shaded throughout the morning, correct?
Until 10 a.m.
Until 10 a.m.? Did you notice the layout of this parking lot? When you were driving it for 30 minutes, and so that the jury understands, you didn't take this Tucson outside of the parking lot and traversing the busy Atlanta traffic?
No, we stayed within the parking lot.
Okay, yeah. So you were doing basically laps around this parking lot for 30 minutes?
Yes.
So you got a really good view of all these parking spaces, right?
Not necessarily. I was primarily just focused on driving the vehicle.
Okay. Driving safely, I guess?
Certainly.
Okay. Did you adjust the mirrors at all to make sure that nobody was coming behind you, or that you weren't going to cut somebody off?
No. Again, the purpose of the test, I was trying to leave the vehicle as close as possible as the as-found condition, so I purposely didn't do any adjustments like that.
All right. Well, you'd agree that a spot like right here, can you see that, where my pen is pointing?
Yes.
Okay. It doesn't have 3 big trees surrounding it like the spot that Mr. Harris parked in.
The photograph speaks for itself, yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that the spot that Mr. Harris parked in, those 3 trees and the tree line behind it provided shade for that spot?
Well, again, part of the data that I took was to run a video monitoring the car at all times so that the shade of the trees could be monitored versus the sun. And the bottom line is, for that particular spot, my knowledge is that the sun starts to touch upon the car at 10 a.m. As far as what happens at other spots, I don't have any recollection. I didn't record that.
In your report, you had indicated that there's 2 discrepancies that you noticed in your data, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And one of those discrepancies was something that you called drift effect.
Yes.
Simply put, is that a change in the temperature?
It's a function of our data recording system. So our data recording system software had 2 different settings on it. One setting was in play if it was accounting for variations around the recorder. The default from the manufacturer was to have that option turned off. My preference on the day of testing would have had that option on, and I wasn't aware of that setting. So what we found at the end of the day is when we look back at our raw data, that we had turned off and on the unit at 2 different times and noticed a discrepancy in the end temperature at the stop of one run and the start temperature at the start of the other. So for example, at 11:30 in the morning, I had my engineer shut down the system and restart. The purpose for it was I wanted to make sure our data was being saved properly. We'd been out there for about 2.5 hours, and out of caution, I wanted to make sure we were capturing the data. I didn't want to go the whole day and find out something wasn't being captured. To do that, we had to turn the software off momentarily, save the data, and then restart. And what I noticed when I got done with my testing the next day and looking at the data is that the end temperature at the end of the one run differed by about 6 degrees from the start temperature of the next run. And what council's bringing up, what I call drift in my report, is that after we discovered that, we did some extensive follow-up testing at our lab, had some contact with the manufacturer of the system, and what we concluded in our testing is because the switch setting was, the default was in the position it was, that the unit itself, all of the data would drift together, and it was over a time period. So the longer the unit operated, this drift would get more and more. So in our data set, after about 3 hours, the drift was on the order of 6 degrees. And the way to think about it then is when we restart the system, it's always reading true. There's no drift in the restart value. The drift is in the end value. So what you're seeing in the reflection of the curves here is we took our raw data, recognizing this drift, and put a correction in for it. And that's what this data represents. But the actual raw data itself, we had this drift in there. So after on the order of 3 hours, we have a 6-degree drift. And that's what I was reporting on my report to Cobb County, and my understanding to the defense as well.
Okay. And it's your opinion that in all cases, when the unit, and talking about the unit, it's your testing mechanism, is initially started, the data recorded is unbiased, okay, and that's consistent to what you just explained to the jury. And as time progresses, the drift in data becomes more prominent, right?
That's correct.
It becomes less accurate.
The raw data itself is straying from what the true values should be, yes.
How do you know what the true values should be?
Well, that was the fortunate side, is every time we restarted the system, we had a start point that we knew was accurate within the uncertainty of the reading equipment. And that happened at 2 different times. Essentially at 11:30 in the morning, we performed a restart, and again at 2:30 in the afternoon. So both at 11:30 and 2:30, there was no drift associated with the data at all. But again, to answer your question though, because I had that restart and I knew where the point should be versus where it was in the raw data, I could then interpolate the data so that it would account for this drift.
I mean, this sounds really complicated, and I don't mean any disrespect, but could you have just put a thermometer inside the vehicle and taken photographs of it from inside throughout the day? I mean, wouldn't that be a measure of the temperature inside the vehicle?
It would be one mechanism of it. The trouble with a basic just bulb thermometer is I don't get a continuous reading. I'd have to periodically check it. That's partly why things like thermocouple systems have been invented. So you can do these things remotely. Certainly in hindsight, there's all sorts of things. I certainly wish that default switch was set to accommodate for the drift factor, but it wasn't. So when I discovered this issue, out of abundance of caution, the last thing I wanted to do was provide misleading information, especially to those trying the facts. And again, we spent quite a bit of time looking at the data to make sure that what you're seeing up there on that graph is what I believe to be an accurate reflection of the temperatures. On the other hand, one can certainly graph the raw data as it exists, and we can talk about that data as well. And the raw data, in a sense, would be more conservative as far as temperature rise, because the drift in the first two segments was always under-predicting the temperature. So when we turned off the unit, it thought it was at this value. For example, at 11:36 a.m., the unit was reading due to drift about 82 degrees Fahrenheit at the child care seat. When we restarted, it was actually 88. So what's reflected there is taking the drift out, but I would have no problem discussing data with respect to the actual raw data as well. Just keeping in mind the raw data is going to be more conservative, or is going to be reflecting lower temperatures than what was in the cabin.
The raw data, the temperatures that you've reported are going to be less than the actual temperatures inside the vehicle.
It's going to be less, especially at the tail end. Always remember, when the data started up each time, there is no drift. So as time progresses, and it's a slow progression, at the end of about 2.5 hours, we get about a 6 degree temperature drift. So if we were putting the raw data up there around 11:30, it would be recording essentially a value 6 degrees lower at 11:36 than what it truly was.
What I think might be difficult for members of the jury to understand is, based on your testimony, a vehicle can be closed, 3 hours can go by, and according to this testing, we should expect the outside temperature to be the same as the inside temperature of the vehicle. I mean, can you explain why that may not jive with just our own personal experiences?
Again, all I can speak for is the testing we did that day. So for this particular vehicle, with the AC run for that period of time, that it took until 11:30 before the inside and outside caught up to each other. But again, one of the things I want to point out with this data is that the issues we're talking about in the morning, all these variables that could come in, whether the AC was run, whether the AC was not run. From my perspective, my academic training and background, I would not expect any of those variables to have any meaningful effect on the temperatures, especially in the afternoon.
Except for a human being inside that vehicle and humidity affecting the temperature inside that vehicle. That is a variable that you didn't account for and would affect the temperature inside the vehicle.
I didn't account for it, but based again on my understanding of heat transfer, the primary objects in the vehicle, they would not be affected by the humidity in the air. At one point in my graduate work, my thesis evolved around radiation and penetrating through the atmosphere. And a factor in that can be humidity, but based on that training and understanding, as far as this particular testing goes, whether it's 30% humid or 60% humid, which is relatively high for an outdoors, it would not really make any significant difference on the air recording temperatures that day. What may make a difference is if you have a body that can be its own generation of heat, and we've talked about that before. But as far as the overall effect of what the humidity was in the car, short of it dripping wet, it wouldn't make any difference in this study.
Right, because inanimate objects they're not affected by the heat index. The heat index doesn't mean anything to a pen or an amplifier, but the heat index accounts for how humans feel when there is humidity and heat. Correct?
Well, again, my background is not relating air temperature to how humans would feel. That's somebody else's area of study. All I can tell you is on that particular day, without a person in it, these were the kind of temperatures that were occurring.
When you were Googling to look at the literature, did you come across studies since the 70s that examined the internal environment of motor vehicles?
I don't recall that specific. Again, I recall one report in Australia that it seemed to be been done in the 90s or 2000s. But I didn't do any vast literature research of car vehicle temperatures. I just did a survey to help me understand and come up with a game plan. I already had a thought process, and that type of studies just reconfirmed what I was planning on doing with air temperature measurements is what others have done in the past.
Did you come across a demonstration of Dr. Ernie Ward determining how hot it gets in a parked car, and over the span of 30 minutes, it gets to be over 100 degrees inside that vehicle?
I don't remember a specific study. I have seen studies where there's discussions of, depending on the circumstance, you can have on the order of a 20 degrees Fahrenheit rise within a matter of an hour. Again, I use that just based on my own data. If you look at, when we get to about 1 o'clock, that's when the sun hits a period where it's shining continuously on the car for about 2.5 hours. And the graph speaks for itself, but you can see the rise in the curves responding to it. And again, the temperature rises on the order of about 20 degrees in an hour or so. So those studies, again, all I was looking for was just if there's anything that seemed out of context with the data I took, and I didn't see anything. As far as more specific things of human bodies and things, I just simply wasn't looking for that information at the time.
Did you come across PSAs that have studied and discussed how dramatically hot it can get within a vehicle within 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes?
No, other than just confirmation that the temperatures that we achieved are not out of line with other studies. So much depends, again, it's depending on the air temperature outside the vehicle, depending on the type of vehicle, and depending on what the sun's doing. All these are factors. All I can tell you, regardless of any studies out there, is this is a good representation of the temperatures on the day that I did testing.
But not a good indication of how hot it was for Cooper Harris and how hot it was inside that vehicle.
I think it's...
Morning and afternoon of June 18th, 2014.
I would disagree in that the temperatures displayed there were for July 8th, based on the weather reports of what was going on June 18th, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks prior. The key ingredients to me is outdoor temperature and the amount of sunlight lighting on the vehicle. And certainly outdoor temperature, as we talked about before, matched well with what's on June 18th. The other issue would be the sun. And I can tell you what the sun was doing that day. I haven't looked back for detailed studies on what the sun was doing on June 18th, but those are the two main factors governing the temperature in the vehicle. So discussions of what the cabin temperature was at the start of our test, to me that's really a non-factor for those temperature ranges. So yes, I would say this is useful information to help the jury better decide on their deliberations as far as what air temperature was in the vehicle at the time, short of the physical body being in it, of course.
And I'm not suggesting that your test should have included a human being or that you should have sat in there to see how hot it felt to you, but there is a way to measure heat index, correct?
I'm sure there is. It's not something I've done before. But again, there's no point in me doing it because for this testing, I don't have a person in the vehicle. I'm just simply measuring air temperature in response to inanimate objects within the vehicle itself. I mean, there was no reason in my testing to consider heat index.
And with all due respect, you were hired on a case where a child had died in a hot car. You knew that, right?
Certainly.
Right. And the whole purpose of your testimony and your testing is to give this jury an idea of the temperature inside that vehicle on June the 18th, 2014, where there was a human being inside that vehicle.
Yes, and I think this data does provide insight to that because, again, a body in the vehicle, in the morning, it's going to generate heat. So in the morning, that body's actually going to add heat to the cabin air, and to some degree, it's going to raise the temperature of cabin air more than my data shows. Conversely, unfortunately, at some point the body may quit generating heat. And
Like passing away?
certainly. But the bottom line on this is that whether there's a person in it or not, I personally wouldn't expect from my experiences in heat transfer that it would make a substantial difference in cabin air temperature, especially in general in the cabin. I mean, you may say, well, it may vary 3-4 degrees, for example, but certainly not on any real order of magnitude. So I think this data is useful to a jury. It certainly gives you an insight that if there's no object in it and you were to enter the vehicle at a given time, you know how warm the air is when you enter that vehicle and are placed in it. Now, once you're in there, you're affecting that atmosphere and things could change. But the bottom line is if I went into that vehicle at 2:30 in the afternoon, for example, and I get inside the vehicle, at that instant, it's about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Once I'm in the vehicle, I'm now part of the heat transfer mechanism, and I personally now am affecting what's going on. But it's at 120 at that point.
Judge, may I have a moment, please? And just to clarify one point, the opinion that you were paid to offer was regarding testing about air temperature in the vehicle, not what the temperature of a human being would be experiencing at different hourly benchmarks throughout the day.
Well, again, I think as I just discussed, the temperatures that you see there, one way to look at it is if someone were to enter the vehicle at any instance, that's what the air temperature would be. As far as the influence of a person in the vehicle, like a child, over how that graph would go, depending on whether it's generating heat or not, it would make a difference. But again, from my background and training, I don't think it would make a meaningful difference in temperature as far as the air temperature of the vehicle goes.
You're focusing on the air temperature in the vehicle without a human being inside of it, correct?
That was the focus of this testing, but my answer just now is saying that had there been a child in the vehicle, if we had done that, for example, that the air temperature monitoring data would not change significantly. Now, certainly in the near vicinity of the car seat it would, because there's a person there now. But if you got just away from the car seat, I don't think you'd find any meaningful temperature difference.
But there's a meaningful temperature difference around the car seat with a human being inside of it throughout different benchmarks of the day, but this testing doesn't account for that.
It doesn't account for the influence of a body generating heat, but again, it's my opinion it wouldn't matter. If you did this test with the body or without, I don't believe you'd see a substantial difference in these temperature curves as far as what the air temperature was at the same height of the car seat.
In the car seat would be different though. That's a meaningful difference, as you said.
No, because again, I would expect the difference. For example, let's conservatively say the difference is plus or minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the instance. So if that's meaningful as far as other people using this data, I can't answer that either way. That's not part of my testimony. But no, I wouldn't expect it to have a big difference on the temperature result.
And at the conclusion of this data, and compiling this data and this testing, you didn't verify and compare it to what people had actually done in studying children that died in hot cars. You didn't compare your work to any of those experiments.
I'm not sure what you mean. Are you talking about where they did experiments where they did testing with a human subject in the car?
I'm talking about researchers and scientists that accounted for heat index, humidity, actually got inside of a vehicle with a thermometer, a real basic thermometer, and took photographs and videotaped themselves sweating and looking at the thermometer as it gets above 100 and whatever degrees within minutes. You didn't compare your data to that because it's remarkably different.
Well, again, first of all, I totally disagree. It's remarkably different. The data would be the same regardless of the person in it. As far as doing that studies, very important factor in my world is I've got to be careful when I'm working with clients that I'm doing work that's within the scope of my abilities. And I'm a mechanical engineer. I work in the world of heat transfer with inanimate objects. As far as heat index and the way the body performs, there's certainly studies out there that are done, and there's expertise in that area that I don't have. So all I'm presenting in my work is what the air temperature would have been on the date of my testing. I'm also presenting that discussions of humidity and a body in the vehicle, I don't foresee that as making any real difference in the data. As far as how that relates to how a child would respond or a person would respond to that environment, that's outside the scope of my work, that's outside of the scope of my expertise, and that's simply why I didn't look into those issues. It would be inappropriate for me to do that and try to present that as information to those that have to make these decisions. I don't want to mislead you.
Thank you. I need a couple of minutes, Judge, to show a flash drive so we can authenticate it. Would it be possible to take our morning break so I don't waste the jury's time in doing that?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, take a little break. Close your notepads, open mind, close mouth, have a nice break. We normally break for about 15 minutes.
It's all right, I'm good. Please watch yourself on the way down.
Yeah.